Come on, Benny. There we go. Evening, Martin. Oh, geez. I gotta update the titles here. That's what I was forgetting. That's always something.
Benny Goodman, ladies and gentlemen, the man with the
Evening, Sue, Lori, Karen, Richard, Carol, Mary.
In the urban room of the Congress Hotel in Chicago. And first of all, one of Irving Berlin's greatest hits, Blue Skies.
See if I can fix that a little bit. Evening, Susan, Nancy, Sarah, Becky. Hey, Heidi. Hey, Susan. Hey, Timberly. Hey, Octavio. Hey, Ambrose. Baby Ambrose is out there. All right. Hey, Bella. Hey, Casey. Doreen, we are in New York tonight. Hey, Sherlock. Evening, Jan. Hey, Marie. Hey, Steve. Hey, Sherlock. Hey, Carolyn and Lynn. Hey, everybody. I'm putting this one together all day. Hope I get it all right. It's a tricky one. Tricky in person, it's tricky online. Richard, I'm not in New York today. We're doing this virtually. I'm coming to you live from Chicago. Hey, Death Wishes. Hey, Gina. Hey, Elena. Linda, Megan, Carol, Kathleen, anybody I might have missed. Evening, Jenna. Happy Thursday, Lori. We're back. Couldn't run last Thursday. Remember, there was the night of the lounge singer in New Jersey. Lounge singers exist almost entirely in New Jersey in the 1970s. Hey, Jordana. Hey, Christine. Hey, Heather. Hey, Ava. Welcome along, everybody. Hey, Teresa and Joanne. Hey, Laura. Welcome anybody new, especially. This is true I've done in person several times, but not since before the pandemic. Hey, Ann, wish I was running in person tomorrow. Hey, Christy. Everybody say congrats to Christy. She and my sister got engaged. And I've usually introduced her as my sister's girlfriend, now my sister's fiancée, soon to be my sister-in-law. Hey, Evelyn. Hey, Bruce. That's quite all right, Lori. Hey, Robert. Evening, Liam. I believe this is baby Ambrose's first mysterious Chicago tour, too. Big the doozy for tonight. Hey, Diane. Hey, Emily. Hey, Evelyn. Hey, Debbie. Ah, Karen, that's rough. Glad you're back. Glad you can tune in someplace, though. Hey, Mary. Hey, Laura. Hey, Paula. For I am yours sincerely with all my heart. Hey, Laura. Hey, Lisa. Hey, MJ, happy retirement. And what, he's gonna stop you watching for watching a tour now? Hey, Katie. Day you came along. Hey, Mars. Hey, Leah. Hey, Peggy. Hey, Bob. I'm all right. Hey, Kim. Well, welcome back. There'll be some stuff you remember from previous grave robbing presentations before. You know, the tips and tricks, and the vocabulary is mostly the same. Totally different stories in New York, though. So we're dealing with more 18th century grave robbing here. Not so much with the 19th. By the time grave robbing got started in Chicago, they had stopped burying people in Manhattan. For the most part. There's still some up in, like, Trinity Uptown. That's way on the other side of the island from where we are right now. Manhattan is about the same size in terms of square miles as Urbandale, Iowa, my hometown. It's like half a square mile off. Bob, I know you got the shot. Bob, you got tattoos. But I got some shovels down in the basement. Hey, Jocelyn and Luke. Down in the communal laundry area. I'm guessing the shovels are communal as well. Hey, Grandma Belle. Hey, Barbara. Hey, everybody. Tonight I am drinking a Two Doors Down, which is rye, apricot, lemon, and ginger. I got it at one of the sites on the tour. Oh yeah, Sarah, there's another Murder Maps book out there, the UK one, that has a few American sites. They already beat me to Johann Hawk, you believe it? Eleanor, yeah, the good news, my sister and Christy got engaged. Hey, Wexley in Maine. Thanks, Richard. Hey, Dirk in Kalamazoo. Well, Bob, you're eligible for that second one. Go for it. I actually took my first COVID test a couple hours ago. I've had a weird thing going on with my tonsils. It's not supposed to be a symptom, but I got a little bit nervous, so I took a test. Negative. Hey, Brian, we'll have Benny Goodman do one more tune here. Evening, Mary. We'll let Benny do one more song, then we'll get started properly. Christy, how were you surprised? That's just... Oh, thanks, Sam. Joining the Patreon is one of the best things you can do. Today's post was a couple hours late. For that, I apologize. I'll be back in New York in about 2 weeks. And again in about a month. I got this weird thing going on with one of my tonsils that makes it hard to swallow. But the doctor said, no, it's not strep, it's not tonsillitis. You just probably busted it up with a popcorn kernel or something. That would make sense. Okay, Laura, we're still giving it another minute. Notifications have been weird lately. Next week on Patreon, I think we'll cover the weird case of Al Capone living in Rogers Park, which is one of those things that sounds really fake. Al Capone is said to have lived pretty much everywhere he ever set foot, and many places where he didn't. That recent news story about the mansion in New Jersey, and for instance, that was supposed to be a Capone hideout. Find me one bit of data that says Capone was there, other than the guy who lived there in the 70s said so. All right, that's Benny wrapping up. We're live from the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. So I think that means it is time that we got going properly over here. All right, I'm slightly nervous about this one. I haven't done this tour in a long time. Welcome along, everybody. I'm Adam Seltzer for Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian in Chicago and New York for going on 20 years now. Got about a dozen Chicago history books out, including Mysterious Chicago, the book. H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, Murder Maps USA, and upcoming this August, Graceland Cemetery, Chicago's Stories, Symbols, and Secrets. And one of the first tours that I did outside of ghost tours, besides a couple of cemetery tours, was one called Grave Robbing 101. We call it everything you could use to launch your career as a 19th century body snatcher today. And then that was also the first walking tour that I ran in New York. It's a completely different stories, as it turns out. A lot of the vocabulary is the same, but the stories are a little bit older. Grave robbing in New York had its heyday a good couple of generations before it had its heyday in Chicago. So this is a whole walking tour district. It's one I presented a few times, a couple of times a year in New York, down in the financial district. Last week I was in town, so I was able to finally get the footage to do it properly. So this is very exciting. I've never done Grave Robbing 101 NYC virtually before. I've been going over my notes. It's been a few years since I really did this one. If you've been on Grave Robbing 101 here in Chicago, and we're doing it live in a couple of weeks, there's some of the stuff will be familiar to you. The vocabulary is mostly the same. The tips and tricks on how to rob a grave are more or less the same, but the history is quite a bit different. And of course, the scenery especially is quite a bit different. So we're going to start right where I always do, at George's, just down the block from Trinity. We'll go ahead and spin and take the walk up from here. This is where I usually have everybody gather, right up these stairs. So I'll let people make their way down this hallway here. Make sure everybody's out of the way. That's right, guys, go in there. And here we will pause so I can give the proper introduction. So welcome everybody to Grave Robbing 101. Again, this is Grave Robbing 101. If you want a Dr. Scott Science refresher course, that is down the hall. So we're here to talk about grave robbing today. So, grave robbing, question number one. Why would anybody rob a grave? Usually the first thing people say if they haven't taken the class before is to get jewelry. And that's really very rare. It happened a lot more in like ancient Egypt. By the 1700s, people were so paranoid about grave robbers that people tended not to be buried with anything all that great. Really, the number one reason that people rob graves in the United States has been to get medical cadavers. By the 1750s or so, medical schools had figured out that they really can't train a new doctor without giving them dead bodies to practice on. Certainly by the end of the 1700s. Now, it's first known to have happened in New York. A couple of guys named Dr. John Bard and Dr. Peter Middleton are said to have done the first dissection in New York in 1750 on the body of an executed murderer named Hermanus Carroll. Trouble with this is I can't find a single reference to it happening from before 1812, so it's one of those things that's kind of an enduring mystery, but it's probably about right. Now, just like in the Chicago tour, I always got to start by talking about my favorite grave robber, Dr. A.J. Baxter. Well, favorite is a relative term, but he gave a great interview to the Tribune one day. They went around talking to doctors about their best medical story because it was a slow news day, and he said, "Well, I tell you, these starched and ramroddy medical professors of today would really have their eyes open if they saw what we boys got up to back in the 60s. I always want to say, like, back in the 60s, man. In those days, cadavers were frightfully scarce. People were just not dying with any creditable rapidity. Perhaps they were too busy. But medical science could not be allowed to suffer, so I was perforce compelled to become a bold and burking resurrection man." Now, there's a couple of vocabulary words that we have to cover here. One is burking. Burking is a method of execution named after Burke and Hare, a couple of grave robbers from Scotland, who figured out that they could get bodies in much better condition and save themselves a lot of digging if instead of robbing graves, they just created their own corpses. And their way of doing this was by pressing down on the chest really hard until somebody suffocated. That left you with a body in very good condition, hence the name burking. I'm pretty sure that's not what Dr. Baxter said he was doing at the time. He just wanted to use that word. So, he also said he had become a bold and burking resurrection man. So that's vocabulary word number one. Resurrection man was a common newspaper term at the time that meant one who digs up dead bodies. It had been going back for quite a while. Charles Dickens uses it in A Tale of Two Cities. It was really fairly common, resurrection man or resurrectionist. It was also known as body snatcher. That came up quite a bit. Ghoul is a very interesting word. In the 19th century, it usually meant one who digs up dead bodies. Before that, it usually meant one who eats dead bodies. And now it's just kind of a catch-all term for a monster or ghost. Now, if you really wanted to charge for your services, you would call yourself a professional subject gatherer. Or occasionally you would run across an instance of people being referred to as purveyors of meat specializing in long pig. Now, if you could use one of these terms properly, there was really good money to be made in grave robbing. At peak times, at least in Chicago, medical schools were paying something like $25 to $50 a corpse. That'd be a month's salary working in the coal mines. Now, typically, back in New York, there wasn't as much money involved in it. Usually, it was medical students rolling up their sleeves and doing it themselves back in the 1780s. Medical students had a very strange sense of humor. They kind of had to. They were digging up bodies out of churchyards and telling stories about it and making jokes about it. They kind of had to have weird senses of humor. The seventh grade effect, like I talk about in cemeteries, would have been very much a thing in these cases. Let's proceed on up the corner here. Now, at the time, we're in Lower Manhattan right now. Down about at the southern tip, if we took a right, we would come to Battery Park before too long. We could get on a cruise to see the Statue of Liberty. But coming up right in front of us here is Trinity Church. You can see it looming out there on the other side of the wall. And just to show you, there's a picture I got earlier in the day just to show you the scale of this wall that we're at right here. This is, you can see about how high it is. Just beyond where this woman is walking is the corner we have ended up on. This is the wall to Trinity Church and Graveyard. We're going to make our way around the corner up here, just so you can see where we're at. So this is the old Trinity Church. At one point, the churchyard itself was quite a bit larger, and it was surrounded by lots of other churches, each with their own graveyard. In fact, as of 1860, by this time, grave robbing was really pretty much over in New York, but a congressional speech said, "The practice of grave robbing is best known in New York, the lurking place of all that is villainous and degrading." High five, New Yorkers. All right. So Trinity Church occupies a churchyard and a yard around it that is about the size of a good-sized suburban house backyard and front yard today. Looking around it, you could look around and say there are probably 2, maybe 500 people buried here. Exactly how many there really are is not exactly known, or at least not exactly agreed on. The number people like to toss around is 250,000. I really can't imagine it's that many. I think that probably comes from there was this mid-18th century report on population that said that was the whole population in the general area around Trinity Church. I would say, though, that 20,000 is not really unlikely. Well, notice again, it's this far up above the sidewalk over here. Now, there were just piling up bodies one on top of the other for years here. Exactly how many people are here is impossible to know. Records were lost in a fire years and years and years ago. And at the time, a body would last in the ground about 3 or 4 years. Even into the 1840s, they would say that every turn of the shovel would turn up some human remains. There was a pit over in the corner that they called the bone pit. When they dug a body up and had bones come up, they would just toss it all into the bone pit someplace. The fact that they were double stacking the graves, or triple or quadruple or quintuple stacking the graves, didn't really seem to bother much of anybody, except for anybody who walked past it and had to smell it. This place was absolutely disgusting in those days. In fact, in 1822, a guy was hired to come and pour lime all over the place. He had a crew of men, 55 barrels of lime. He said that as they were pouring it, the stench was so overpowering that it caused my men to cascade freely. Cascade being another word for puking. That's one of them that I really wish it would kind of make a comeback. So I kind of imagine, cascade. I can imagine the guys like slipping on the puke, and then their blood and guts and brains spill out, and other people come over and slip on the puke and blood and guts and brains, and then their blood and guts and brains are spilling out all over the place. We'll just move on, shall we? We'll move up along the wall here. But incidentally, we will pause just a bit and talk about this building over on the right here. Now, Trinity Church, as I said, used to extend quite a bit further. At one point, there was a Lutheran church over across the street, which had its own graveyard that's extended quite a ways further down. Eventually, Trinity bought it up and had everybody moved, but by move, that usually meant that they were dug up, put in carts, and thrown into the East River. They were still finding graves from it years and years later. This is a newspaper clipping from the 1890s. You can see they had found a couple of barrels worth of bones a couple of floors down when they were excavating sites to put up the building that is there currently. And initially they thought perhaps it was murder victims. Then they realized, no, there was just a graveyard here once, and they probably didn't come anywhere close to getting everybody. As we'll see, there were a lot of other places like that in the general vicinity and around what is now the financial district. We'll make our way up here just a little bit further. Over on the left, in a little field behind this larger one, is Hercules Mulligan, the time when he fell and didn't get back up again. So, sorry, too soon. But here, the large lit up one, that is Alexander Hamilton. Probably the most famous interment at Trinity Church. And really, let me move this over just a little bit. Here's a front view of it. You can see Alexander is right there. His son is thought to be in the vicinity around here someplace as well, but he doesn't have a marker of his own. And again, the records are long gone, so they assume he's nearby, but no one's sure. Eliza is directly in front of him. And they've changed the sign now. This one isn't here anymore, but you can see back behind, we are probably the lowest prices in the city. So if you angled your camera just right, you could get Alexander and Eliza and a shoe store that wasn't entirely confident. We'll pause right about there. So, In 1788, Alexander Hamilton may have participated in something called the Doctors' Mob. Now, this was a thing where people around New York suddenly found out where the medical schools were getting all of their dead bodies. And this got people really upset. There was a full-scale riot. Lasted over a couple of days. At least one person was killed. There was lots of violent activity going on. It was, by some metrics, the first proper riot in American history. Depending on when you start American history from, the Constitution was just a year old. Hamilton was busy at work on the Federalist Papers at the time. John Jay, another Federalist Papers author, was also involved in the mob. So were several of the other founding fathers, and over the course of this tour, we're going to be kind of collecting people. We're going to be collecting people who were involved in the Doctors' Mob of 1788, the anti-doctor grave-robbing riot. Most of it was the mob. We don't really have any names of people who were involved in the mob. People like Hamilton were involved in trying to protect the doctors and trying to keep the mob at bay. Whether Hamilton was actually there or not is kind of difficult to determine. His son says he was there in a biography, but none of the contemporary accounts mention it. However, he just lived about 2 blocks away. It would not really be like him to stay home when there was a riot going on. Except for one other wrinkle, is that one of his children was born on that same day too. Which to me just makes it more likely that his son, who was born after this, would know the story, because you can just imagine every time the kid born that day's birthday rolled around, Elizabeth Hamilton would be up there, so there I was, in labor, and your father had to go fight a bunch of grave robbers. Seems like the kind of thing he would have done. And in fact, after a couple of weeks after the mob, there was an article in a New York paper written about the legality of grave robbing. It's not signed, it's by a clearly loquacious New York lawyer. Hamilton fits the bill. There were only so many lawyers at the time there. Of course, it could also be Aaron Burr. But we'll move up the rest of the way up the churchyard from here. Up along the fence. It's so cool to get footage of a cemetery at dusk. We can never really do that properly in Chicago. Especially once I get up over the fence. Statue is James Watt, a congressman. There's not much interesting I can say about him for as big as that, as big as his grave is there. Move along past him here. We'll just get kind of a sense of where we are when we get a little bit further up here. Again, nobody really knows how many people are buried there. Most of the graves are unmarked. A lot of the grave markers have been illegible for years. There's like an 1890s compendium of what they all said, or how well they could be read. And even then, a lot of them were already illegible. Some of them I can actually put together myself by comparing it to other epitaphs. Very few of the epitaphs on there are really original. But you do see ones like, "When the Lord sees fit to end my time, with thy beloved dust I'll mingle mine." And here's Trinity Church, the current version built in the 1840s. At the time, it was the highest spot in the city. As we get along to the other side, you can see the opposite side graveyard, the north end. And right in front, you've got this whole row of slabs. Now, one of these slabs here, and these slabs were specifically probably designed to thwart grave robbers. Now, a lot of what you see here, a lot of what you see in these series yards, when you see one that's just flat on the ground, that's actually a vault entrance. There are only a couple of vaults that are still accessible. Now and then they'll even move one of the gravestones to see if there's still a staircase underneath it, or if there ever was a staircase underneath it. But the whole underneath of this is just honeycombed with these little crypts. A couple of them are accessible from inside the church. They just did a really big restoration on the Bleecker Vault down there. But one of these is the grave of Dr. Charles McKnight. He was George Washington's doctor for a while, and also one of the doctors who had to hide from the mob in the jail during the doctors' mob of 1788. But really, the seeds for the beginning of that mob began early in 1788, when there was this ad appeared in the New York Daily Advertiser. $100 reward, whereas one night last week the grave of a person recently interred in Trinity Churchyard was open, and the corpse with part of the clothes were carried off. Any person who will discover the offenders so that they may be convicted and brought to justice will receive the above reward from the Corporation of Trinity Church. $100, that would have been really good money at the time. And this was kind of a shocker to people, because generally I think it was known that grave robbing was going on, but most of it was at what we now call the African American burial ground, a couple of blocks north of here. People had less of a problem with bodies being stolen from there. We got to remember the time period. Here's a full version of that page. Up above, wanted to purchase. And then there's a runaway ad down below. About half of the ads in this paper were something to do with slavery. To his credit, Dr. Charles McKnight, along with Hamilton, was a member of the New York Anti-Slavery Society. But after this ad came out, and it turned out that they were also robbing from Trinity, there started being a long back and forth in the Daily Advertiser. There was a guy saying that this practice is horrible and must be stopped, and also a medical student saying, no, it has to go on. You want us to cure your diseases or not? I'd let them dissect my body. I'd dissect my grandfather. There were even some cases. There was a guy named Shippy O'Gray who had started a black burial ground that would be better protected. We don't even know exactly where it is anymore. And he was actually held up at knife point so people could still rob graves that he was trying to protect. So we're going to move along from here a little ways. We'll take one more look at Trinity Church. This here is the Equity Building, designed by Ernest Graham of Graham Anderson Probst and White, which did a whole lot of buildings in Chicago. Now, New York kind of famously has these ziggurat-shaped buildings that get narrower as they get taller. It was because of the Equity Building. That one was so much taller than everything around it, they got worried it was going to block out the sun too much. So they made a new law that there had to be light wells coming in on new buildings. We had that law for a while in Chicago, too, but it didn't have nearly the impact that it did in New York. We just weren't building as many buildings during the Art Deco era. From here, we're making our way through these long and narrow streets. Most of Manhattan is on the grid system, the streets from after about 1812. They got 1st Street, 2nd Street, 1st Avenue, 2nd Avenue, etc. But down here in Financial District, it's old Indian trails. It's old places where the cows used to walk. Over to the right is Wall Street, which is where the wall was that they built after Governor Stuyvesant made a treaty with the native tribes across the river, then killed most of them anyway and built a wall in case anybody came to get revenge. That's how Wall Street got its name. But coming up along the edge here is the back of Federal Hall. Now, before Washington, D.C. was made the United States capital, though no one else was in the room where it happened, where the deal was made, New York was where a lot of the government was. This was where George Washington was sworn in as President of the United States. It would have been on the other side of the building, but it looks about the same. One of the great neoclassical buildings of New York with the pillars and the pediment-style roof. Here is George Washington on his inauguration, make this a bit bigger, accompanied by Captain Stakes, who was one of the guys who came in to fight the mob during the Doctors' Mob. There's talk of him riding up on his horse onto the steps of St. Paul's Church, which we'll see later on. Now, grave robbing was something Washington had to deal with among the troops. During the war, bodies were taken by medical schools pretty regularly. He himself is thought to have taken some teeth from many of the soldiers, but still put out this order. Complaint has been made to the general that the body of a soldier of Colonel Benjamin Ruggles, Woodbridge's regiment, has been taken from his grave by persons unknown. The general and the friends of the deceased are desirous of the information that can be given of the perpetrators of the abominable crime that he or they may make an example of to deter others from committing so wicked and shameful an offense. He did put out a general anti-grave robbing order, but nobody paid too much attention to it. Now, Washington himself may have been a grave robbing victim himself. This is his current tomb in Mount Vernon. They moved him to this current one about the 1820s, 1830s. Right now you can see right inside of it. And now it's in very good shape, but as of the 1820s or so, there were bones just piled up all over the place. Now, it was said that when they moved into this place, they opened the coffin to see if he was still there, because there were occasional rumors that his skull had been stolen or something, and made it known to everybody who asked that yes, not only was he still there, but he was still perfectly preserved and in good condition. That went around for a while, but in 1839, a travel writer for the New Yorker went to visit Mount Vernon and remarked that out loud. Isn't it nice that his body was in such good condition? And then felt a tap on the shoulder from one of the servants who had been present. He said, an old family servant who was allowed to be with them assured me that the body was completely decayed. The hair and dust had fallen from the head, exposing the naked skull. At least he says the skull was still there. Now, there was at least one attempt to steal the body. There was a disgruntled employee who went to try to steal his head, but it was such a mess in there that he got the wrong head. That's a story that started going around in the late 1800s. I wish there were better sources on it than there actually are. But this is at Mount Vernon in Virginia. Mandy Crypt of, I think, Chicago was out there with a school group just today. And we'll talk a little bit more about skull thieves a little bit later on. It's a practice known as cranioclepsy. We're just going to move a little ways across the street. Now, right opposite Federal Hall was a place called the Old French Church. And right where we're standing right now was the Old Lutheran Church, both of which had their own graveyard back in the day. Now, this was rumored to be the burial place of Baron von Steuben, who was in charge of turning the people that George Washington called his troops, an exceedingly dirty and nasty people, into actual soldiers through drilling and drilling and drilling. Now, he was called in during the doctor's mob. At one point, he was standing right next to Governor Clinton and said, you know, be nice to them. They're good people. They're just upset. Then he got hit in the head with a rock and shouted, "Fire, Governor, fire!" He was rumored to be buried in this place because there was a memorial to him, but he was never actually interred here. He's in the woods out in Oneida by his own request. Move up just a little ways up. Now, I will cover a couple of the tips and tricks of being a grave robber while we do this. Number one is always bribe the sexton. Number two is you don't have to dig up the entire grave. All you have to do is dig a hole down to the head of the coffin, then cut a hole into the head of the coffin, put a hook through the eyes, and drag the money up on a rope. So as you all know. Now, as I mentioned, this was in the early 1800s, late 1700s, just one cemetery after another. We're at Liberty Street here, which used to be called Crown Street, when we still had a crown. This on the left was the site of the Middle and New Dutch Churchyard. There were a few different Dutch churches. There was the Old Dutch Church, then the Middle Dutch Church, and then the New Dutch Church. Right now we are standing on the site of what was called the New Dutch Church. The cemetery was over on the east side of Nassau, just across the street from where we are right now. Captain John Stakes, the guy that I talked about accompanying Washington at his inauguration, was interred in one of the vaults inside of here. Now, he's almost unknown. There's just a couple of mentions of him, mostly stuff to do with the doctor's mob. He died of stepping on a nail in 1798. But the New Dutch Church across the street from here was disused in 1844. The bodies were all supposed to be removed. The church became a post office in the 1840s that was demolished in 1882. But when they demolished it, workmen found a couple of vaults that were supposed to have had the bodies removed and did not. In fact, they found coffins all over the place, some of them with bones protruding from them. They found decayed caps of old soldiers from the Revolution that were thought that because the vaults were apparently used as prison cells for a while as well. Now, even at the time, the vaults were still intact. One of them was being used as an ice house by a shop that was around here. Plus, there were some other ones that were found under the street. Most likely, they all got moved eventually, but there are those who suggest maybe not. We'll keep on moving up from here a little ways. Moving up this narrow end of Nassau Street. Now, in the 1830s, a lot of these places were being dug up and moved so they could put up skyscrapers. There was one article that said a full-blooded speculator never passes a churchyard in this city that his bowels do not yearn, and his mouth does not water to see the ground lying thus unproductive. His imagination runs riot with the vision of streets and skyscrapers, 6-story stores, rising as if it were from the dead. In the days of ignorance and barbarism, it was held a great sacrilege to disturb the bones of the dead. It was reserved for modern man to sell the tombs, and with them the ashes of their fathers, to speculate in graves, to make a trade of moldering bones. Let anyone pass and view the condition of the graveyard of the old church on Exchange, just to the right of us. It has been sold, stores are erected on the spot, deep cellars are dug, and the remains of the tenants shoveled into carts to fill up swamps. In these vaults once reposed man of the ancient fathers of the city. Where are they now? When the last trump shall sound, and their graves are some to give up their dead, their bones will be scattered. The spirit of speculation, the accursed thirst for gain, has no respect for the remains of the dead. That is from the 1830s. I'm pretty sure my bowels don't do a whole lot of yearning. Never thought my bowels could be so yearny. Why did I decide to roam? Well, we're coming up to John Street here. John Street was the home of Mayor Duane, who was also present for the doctor's mob. After the mob had broken into the hospital, he was the one who came and negotiated. Like, listen, okay, we're going to make this right. We're going to put all these doctors, we're going to hide these doctors in the jail for a while till we can figure out what to do. You guys can take all of the materials. Then the next day when the mob was still going, he just went along with them from building to building, trying to keep them from doing too much damage. He did about as well as he could. We'll proceed up a bit more. Just briefly down the road here. Some of these are pretty good hikes. Good view of the World Trade Center. And just a little ways down, we would come to a building that was once the site of the home of the New York Mirror, which was a newspaper. Sometimes you talk about George Manier at Graceland Cemetery. He got his start at least trying to write poetry for the New York Mirror. About as best as I could find is there's a response from the editor saying, GM's poem is neither bad nor good. And Edgar Allan Poe wrote for them for a while as well. This was been the area of New York that we can trace. I don't know if it was the most, we can trace most of Edgar Allan Poe's stuff here. But a lot of spaces around here. He worked in the building there, then had an office a little bit later on. Now, as we get around here, we also come to the North Dutch Church, which was said to have vaults that were considered highly offensive to the smell. If we were to turn around, we would probably be approximately facing the site where Scipio Gray had his black burial ground that was supposed to be better protected. And also a little over to the right was a rooming house on Pearl, where a guy named Viggo Jansen, who advertised himself as the king of the grave robbers, even tried to do a live demonstration of grave robbing on stage in Washington, D.C., which was a complete mess. He built an artificial grave and everything, but it got heckled the whole time and was really too drunk to do any digging once he got on stage. But died in a rooming house on Pearl Street over back behind us from where we are now. There were a couple of places nearby here that had burial vaults down below as well. But we'll move up just a bit. I'll cruise us up the road a little bit faster until we come to the Beekman. I love this building. This is actually, there's a bar here called Temple Court where I got the 2 doors down, the drink I'm trying to recreate right now. I got strong Inventing Anna vibes from the place. It turned out that was one of the places where she stayed. Back in the old days, there was a place here called Clinton Hall where Edgar Allan Poe had an office. Then eventually it became the Temple Court building, which is what we have now, which has now become the Beekman. But inside of it, beside Edgar Allan Poe's office, was Fowler and Wells' phrenological cabinet. Now, the reason there was such a market for stealing skulls in the 1800s is people got really into phrenology, the idea that they can tell all about you by the bumps and ridges on your skull. This is a place where you could go where they had several skulls collected and on display, including Chief Big Thunder, who had been propped up in like a tent outside of Chicago for a long time until his skull was eventually stolen and brought to these guys. And this is where they published the Phrenological Journal. Now, I would sometimes argue that phrenology is not necessarily any more inherently racist than, like, palm reading, but if you read Fowler and Wells' publications at all, they were racist as hell. They absolutely were using phrenology to prop up racism, which is probably why the bar that was here was originally called Fowler and Wells, but changed their mind really, really quickly. But this was such a popular practice at the time, they could get the skulls of drunks and murderers and poor people without too much trouble, but skulls of notable people, people like George Washington, people like Mozart, there was a huge market for stuff like that, because that was a lot harder, just because that was a lot harder to get. And whether there were a lot of different skulls on the market that were purported to be those of famous people, whether they were really were or not is very much up to debate. Probably not. Like, Mozart was dumped in a mass grave, but later on a guy said, oh, well, I put a copper cord around his neck, so eventually we just dug down and found the skeleton with the copper cord, so here's the skull. Give me your money. Probably not actually true. It was probably an easy way to scam people, as they were just using it for junk science anyway. And just up the road from there was the old site of the New York World building. Off in the distance we can see the City Hall building, designed by McKim, Mead, and White, who were best known in Chicago at least for their graves. Of course, Stanford White is known for a whole other stuff, none of which is exactly savory. But right over here, this was the site of the New York World building. It's now a place called the Potter Building, though the New York World initially had some offices in there, so did several other newspapers over the years. Really cool building. New York World comes up a lot around here. They essentially invented the story of H.H. Holmes operating a hotel to prey on World's Fair victims, which is pretty much par for the course for them. They're a great newspaper to read. They were kind of a combination of like the New York Times and the National Enquirer. They did a lot of pioneering investigative journalism. They also just made stuff up freely. You know, they figured it's the newspaper. It's going to be thrown out tomorrow anyway. It doesn't really matter that much what we say. But it is on the site where back in the 1760s was the old brick church, which this was still kind of considered outside of the city limits at the time. This was here up and through the 1850s or so. Now, they added some new vaults in the 1820s, which were part of what led to the decision to stop burials in Manhattan. They had tubes that were going from the vaults up to the street that they said were there to help preserve the timber, but really they were diverting the smells from the vaults onto the street and away from the congregation inside of the church. So walking past them was absolutely disgusting, and people got worried that, you know, maybe this isn't even safe. Maybe this is bad for your health. There got to be an awful lot of articles and a lot of back and forth about whether having dead bodies around was dangerous. One guy claimed, no, rotten vegetables are way worse. A half cart of rotting cabbage is more dangerous to the health than a rotting elephant on Broadway. I think it kind of depends on what the elephant died of, and what kind of shape the cabbage was in as well. But that one again was torn down in the 1850s. Bodies were supposed to have been moved, but when they do excavations around this vicinity, they tend to find stuff. Hey, Rodriguez. Glad you saw it. Move up the road a little ways here. I'll speed this up. Now, one thing that happens on both the Chicago and New York editions of Grave Robbing 101 is there's a Benjamin Franklin statue on both of them. And Franklin himself does have some grave robbing connections. He was a friend of John Bard, the guy who supposedly dissected Hermanus Carroll in 1750, marking the first dissection in New York. And his son, Samuel Bard, was one of the doctors who was hiding from the mob during the doctor's mob. Also, while Franklin was living in London, they excavated the house where he lived there fairly recently and found lots and lots and lots of bones. And of course, their thought was, ooh, is Benjamin Franklin a serial killer? No, he just lived with a medical student who was in the practice, apparently, of dissecting bodies down in the basement. It's impossible Franklin didn't know about it. We'll take a quick look down the block from here. Down the block, before the Brooklyn Bridge was put in, there was an office for Fisk metallic burial cases, those really ornate metal caskets with a viewing window over the face that have kind of a cult following today. Their office was down this road, but it was a portion of the street that was torn down to make room for the entrance to the Brooklyn Bridge. Let's kind of race our way across the street here. And just take a brief look at Park Row, which we're going to flip around here. This would have been one of the views of Park Row back in the day. It was, a bunch of streets like this. But right at the side of it was Barnum's Museum. Before it was Barnum's Museum, it was the American Museum. Right near it was Peale's Museum. And in the 1830s, they had kind of a battle, Peale's Museum and the American Museum, about unwrapping mummies, which became kind of a craze in the 19th century. People have often seen this invitation that went around: Lord Londonsborough at home Monday, June 1850, at Piccadilly, a mummy from Thebes to be unrolled at 2:30. You sometimes hear that mummy unwrappings were just a very popular Victorian party trick. That's overstating it a little. I mean, there are actual descriptions of this party that was advertised on the invitation. It was all scientists. Unwrapping a mummy was a very dirty process. But it was known to happen. The first time it's known to happen in the United States was a little bit south of here in Battery Park at Castle Clinton in the 1820s. But then in the 1830s, it started happening at the museums. So here's the rules that the American Museum was having. Every gentleman to procure tickets. No gentleman will be allowed to leave his seat on any account. All questions to be directed to the superintendent operator. No ladies admitted. Sorry. Medical men, in order to procure preference of seats, must apply to Dr. Scudder. And then down over here, they talk a little bit more about it. And then down below, there's an ad for Peale's Museum that says they are going to be dissecting 2 mummies. This was kind of a thing. It's usually scientific gatherings. It was never just done at people's houses. Often it was done at museums. There was one particular case where the guy made a really big deal of saying, we're unwrapping one that we know from the hieroglyphics was an Egyptian princess. But then they unrolled below the waist and realized either the Egyptians had a more advanced understanding of gender than we realized, or the guy wasn't very good at reading his hieroglyphics. We'll take a quick look here, too, while we're at it. We're going to cross over into Park Row for a second to show off something we don't really see much of in Manhattan. Well, first we'll see this is the Woolworths building, the site of the Astor Hotel, where H.H. Holmes stayed while in New York. But down here we got something you never really see in Manhattan, an alley. This was called Theater Alley back behind the old Park Theater. Now, when they started planning for the expansion of Manhattan North, they did away with alleys. They decided they were all just too disgusting. They were all full of garbage. There was no garbage pickup at the time. So it's very rare to actually come across one in Manhattan. You read comic books, you think there's an alley on every block that's always full of guys in long underwear plotting a bank robbery or something, or, somebody waiting to kill Bruce Wayne's parents. That's Gotham, not New York. Well, yeah, you very, very rarely see alleys in Manhattan at all. We'll loop back around, back on Park Row, back at this little park. Just over here, we'll take a quick look at King's College. The old King's College site, eventually this was Columbia University, and this really is where the doctor's mob got started. We'll cover a bit more of that once we get around over to the other side. We're going to take a hop, skip, and a jump across the park. Then make our way north, a little bit on Broadway. Checking out this space right here. Well, first of all, off in the distance is the old A.T. Stewart Marble Palace department store, the first really big department store designed by a guy named A.T. Stewart. Shown here, I believe this is often represented as him showing Potter Palmer around. Potter Palmer had the idea, came here to get ideas when he decided to start his department store in Chicago that through various mergers was eventually Marshall Field's. But Mr. A.T. Stewart died in the 1870s. By his own request, he was not buried at all. He was not embalmed, even though embalming was definitely a thing by then. But a few years later, his body was stolen and held for ransom. He was buried up in the New York Marble Cemetery up on St. Mark's Place. If you walk around there, you just see these slabs, but each of these slabs leads to a staircase leading down. Some people broke into this and took him out of there, and he must have been in really bad condition by then. Nobody was really even sure how they managed to do it because the smell was so offensive. When the authorities broke in to see what had happened, they couldn't even go down there for a while because the air was just so incredibly disgusting. This went on for quite some time. It was one of the biggest scandals of the day. There were a lot of theories as to what they could have done to the body, how they could have possibly snuck something so smelly out of New York without anybody noticing it. Eventually, the family paid up. They managed to talk the ransom guys down quite a bit. They initially asked for some exorbitant sum of money, and they talked him down because, what else were they going to do? It was going to have to be a something or nothing situation. Finally, there was a midnight meeting arranged where they paid up a certain amount to get a bag of bones that were said to be Stewart's. He's now rumored not to be buried in that location anymore, but nobody really knows for sure. It was a very big scandal at the time. In fact, when they reported that they were burying George Pullman under cement, steel, and railroad ties in Chicago 20 years later, they didn't talk about him having disgruntled employees who might dig up the body. They talked about A.T. Stewart and the attempted theft on Abraham Lincoln as well. We'll loop around here a little. We'll hop across the street. Make our way down the road just a little bit. Right down here on the day of the mob, this is really about as good a place as any to tell exactly what happened. So right across the street where that park is now, one day in 1788, a bunch of kids were playing, looked up into the window of King's College, and saw a dead body. Now, in some versions of the story, a medical student was waving a dead body's dismembered arm out the window at the kids. One of them had just lost his mother and looked up and said, "Is that my mother's arm?" And the medical student said, "Yes, she's coming to smack you again." It's very difficult to know whether this was true. These stories only came to us third or fourth hand, though it does about line up with the sense of humor of medical students at the time. In any case, what it can be traced back to is somebody saw something. Somebody saw something in the window, some imprudent display of a dead body. So in a short amount of time, dozens of people, by some accounts upwards of thousands, broke into the hospital next door where all the medical schools were. There's a couple of first-hand accounts. One says, the hospital apartments were ransacked. In the anatomy room were found 3 fresh bodies, one boiling in a kettle and 2 others cut up with certain parts of the 2 sexes hanging up in a most brutal position. Another guy said, in a little time near 2,000 men were collected round the hospital to see a scene which struck with horror the most hardened wretch. Anatomies hanging, different parts of bodies, eyes, etc., coffins filled with excrements, a hogshead filled with bones in a pickle, parts of bodies in large kettles boiling, here and there a head, an arm, a leg, a heart, a long table, bloody knives, and a horrid nauseous stench. So, not a pleasant scene. So these guys broke in, threatening to kill all of the doctors. The mayor stepped in, arranged for a few of the doctors to go hide in the jail, which was also in that same park complex, and told them all, okay guys, don't do any damage. You can take all of the specimens, all of the embalmed remains, all of the anatomical specimens. You can take all of those and bury them. And that's what they did. They took them down a couple of blocks to St. Paul's Church, which is still standing. We'll see it in a minute. Buried them out there. At least it's thought to be St. Paul's. They never really specified where it was. Then the mayors just hoped that would be it, but the next day the mob had even gathered in strength and started going around trying to harass any doctor they could find, trying to bust into their place to see if they were hiding more anatomical specimens. People were working very hard to call in the proper militia, but by the time the militia actually came, things had kind of settled down. They managed to break their way into the jail, but once they got there, they weren't really sure what to do. They were kind of the dog that caught the car. But walking right up this street was a medical student named David Hossack. Hossack took a rock to the head and decided, okay, nuts to this, I'm just going to skip school today. So he just turned around and went back home. Later on, he would be the doctor at both the Philip Hamilton duel and the Alexander Hamilton duel. So he's kind of 0 for 2 there. And then bought the land where Rockefeller Plaza now stands, around 1812. From here, we'll proceed down a bit to St. Paul's. This is just a little south of where we were right there. It's the edge of City Hall Park. And across the street, you can see this much smaller building than all of the others. Right on the other side of this was the World Trade Center. In fact, this was kind of a miracle church, so it miraculously didn't get butt crushed by shrapnel on 9/11. We'll cross over to it here. So here you can see the churchyard where the mob eventually managed to push the militia back to. And a better scholar than me could probably come up with some good, interesting stuff about the mob versus the militia and how this relates to the Second Amendment, which was just which did not yet exist. This took place during that weird period of time between the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So here's the new World Trade Center building is in the background here. This is part of St. Paul's Church. We'll walk around to the side of it. Now, right on the inside of the door is a marker for Sir John Temple, Consul General to the United States of America from His Britannic Majesty. He was really kind of the first consul from Britain. And there's an account that during the doctor's mob, the mob came to his door, this half-literate mob, tried to sound out the word Surgeon Temple. Only intervention from the mayor kept them from busting in and killing Sir John Temple, which really would not have been good. Now, on the other side, just like at Trinity, there's more churchyard. We'll check out as we pass. This one has maybe fewer notable people. You can see the Oculus, the new shopping mall / train station down in the distance. Lousy food court. George Eek, the guy who killed Philip Hamilton, is thought to be over on the west end of the park. We'll skip over to the back of it. Spin around from the Oculus to the World Trade Center. So looking down on the churchyard at St. Paul's. Now, directly in front of the church, that largest monument that you can see, the one that's blocking our view of the door from right here, is the memorial to George Frederick Cook. He wasn't a statesman or anything, or a soldier, or the kind of person you'd think would have perhaps the most prominent monument at St. Paul's Church. He was an actor who hated America with a fiery passion and drank himself to death here while he was on tour around 1812. An autopsy was held by Dr. Hossack, who determined that he had died more from alcoholism than anything else. And he was initially buried here at St. Paul's in something that was known as the Stranger's Vault. Now, him being interred there is about the only reference to the Stranger's Vault that exists, so even at St. Paul's, they're not really sure what that meant. Some kind of potter's field. But 9 years later, the actor Edmund Kean decided, we've got to do something about this. I mean, he's the greatest actor there was. He should have a proper memorial. And initially, the bishop was like, you want to bury an actor inside the church? He said, no, I want him in the churchyard. And the bishop was, oh, okay, well, I'm fine with that, sure. So the body was disinterred and moved and put with this fine new gravestone with flames up on the top that point right to the Park Theater where he used to perform. But that removal was supervised by the guy who had assisted Dr. Hossack, a guy named John W. Francis. And while John W. Francis was assisting in the removal, he helped himself to the skull, for reasons unclear. But he let everybody know about this, and sometime later a guy knocked at the door and said, so I'm from the Park Theater. We just lost a lot of our props in a fire, but we're doing a benefit performance of Hamlet tonight. We kind of need a skull. We hear that you have a skull. So George Frederick Cook got to go back on stage and play Yorick. And somewhat remarkably, the skull is still extant. It is currently at Thomas Jefferson University at their library in Philadelphia. And this is one that's really remarkably well documented. John W. Francis himself wrote an account of it. So that's about as close as we can really get on something like this. It all kind of ties together right here. We've got skull thieves, we've got veterans of the doctor's mob involved. Just about everything all comes together right here at St. Paul's Church. So that is Grave Robbing 101 NYC. I want to take a minute here to plug some of the upcoming ones. Upcoming virtual tours are Sunday morning, we're doing Art Deco Chicago. Then a week from today, the second airing of Johann Hawk, Chicago's goofiest serial killer from the late 19th and early 20th century. We also got a couple of in-person ones coming up. Not this Saturday, but the next 2 Saturdays. The 7th, we're doing Rose Hill at noon, Rose Hill Cemetery. And on the 14th, we'll be doing the Chicago edition of Grave Robbing 101 in person in Lincoln Park. Just go to Adam Chicago or MysteriousChicago.com. That'll get you all the ticket information for stuff like that. Should you need a Mysterious Chicago sweatshirt, hoodie, etc., if you want to at least make an attempt to be as cool as Luca is here, CafePress.com/MysteriousChicago has got what you need. And with that, everybody, I'll put the Benny Goodman back on, and we'll hang out for a couple of minutes here. Thanks, everybody. My tonsils may not stick around as long as usual. But all right, thanks, everybody. Here is Benny Goodman in a second. Kathy, there's one guy who's done a Hawk/Bel Gunnis book. I think it could be improved on. But the other Murder Maps book covers Johann Hawk a little bit, so they beat me to that one. So I couldn't put it in my Murder Maps book, Murder Maps USA. Much as I would have liked to. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Christy. Carol, I started in Chicago. A lot of this stuff has not really been that well researched in New York. Yeah, Phoenix, I think it was some Trader Joe's popcorn that's to blame on my part. Well, it's certainly getting to me. Thanks, Deanna. David, you're very late. Well, Aaron, I got some cheat sheets for this one. Thanks, Barbara. Glad to have you here. We do these things all the time. There's also a group on Facebook called Mysterious Chicago Regulars and Miles Fan Club. Miles is my cat who was here earlier. We even have conventions in the fall. This is one of my regular walking tours that I couldn't do virtually because I haven't had a chance to do the I hadn't had a chance to get the footage yet. And yeah, it definitely seems strange to me, Geraldine, to see graveyards like right in the midst of the buildings like that. We just don't have that in Chicago, really. About as close as it comes to St. Henry's up the road from me. Hey, David, glad to have you anyway. Thanks, Kathy. Just sticking around a couple of minutes tonight. Thanks, Marilyn. If I were you, I would get cremated. I definitely intend to. Just one guy on Twitch. Most of the comments come on Facebook Live. But yeah, this is on Twitter, Twitch, Facebook Live, and YouTube. Gary, I'll get there eventually, I'm sure. Thanks, Jerry. Phoenix, I am gargling like a fiend these days. Yeah, this was a drink that I got at the Beekman, at the Temple Court Bar at Beekman, which is really a cool bar. They got a big portrait of Edgar Allan Poe up, just like I like my bars. It is Sazerac rye with apricot, lemon, and ginger. It's not an exact recreation, but I came pretty close. Phoenix, thanks so much. Joining the Patreon is your best deal, especially the $20 tier that gets you a ticket a month. It's actually lower than a walking tour ticket price. You know, why were graves so far underground? A lot of it was just, they weren't that far underground. The ground just got higher and higher as the bodies piled up around it. You see this a lot with like old churches that have graveyards around them back in the old days. You'll see, like in England, the churches tend to look like they're sinking. Pandaroid on YouTube, I've done several talks on H.H. Holmes. We get around to him again. I could overdo him easily, but every couple of months I'll do a Holmes talk. Yeah, my Holmes book is in stores now from 2017, but it's still selling pretty well. You get a lot of cool bonus stuff on the Patreon. Lower tier, you get a coyote in a cemetery photo, plus a Chicago history story every week. Next tier up, you also get more articles about that history story of the week. Next tier up, you get some cool stuff from my H.H. Holmes files, which are pretty voluminous, and some of it's stuff you can't get anywhere else. And then there's the ticket tier. Are there catacombs in Trinity Church? Kinda, but no, I didn't get to see them. Well, we assume Keanu Reeves is playing H.H. Holmes in the movie. They didn't say which part he's playing at, I don't think. He could be playing Geyer or Daniel Burnham. I can imagine him even less as Daniel Burnham. Christine, I wouldn't mind having a place in New York. My work is in Chicago for the most part. But New York rent is a whole other thing. I don't think I could ever talk my wife into it. Oh, sorry about that. I was fiddling with the earphones and it messed up with the audio over here. Oh dear. Now I've gone and done it. There we go. I'll be in New York again in about 2 weeks. And then again in about a month. Priya just hit the window seat. Amy, I was just there with the school group a couple of days ago. I took them to, some of the tourist stops. They went to see Dear Evan Hansen, which I greatly disliked. Really, really, really disliked that show. Now, I got a few notes for the script. Music's okay, but I found it unmemorable. Yeah, on the Patreon, at the higher tiers, you get 4 or 5 hosts a week, so...
Goodman presents On the Alamo.
But I managed to get the foods that I've been craving in New York that you can't really get here, like the Brussels sprouts dish at a Lai and the papaya juice at Gray's Papaya. Or Papaya King, either one, but the stuff just doesn't travel well. You can't really fake it. Yeah, the pizza was fantastic to me because it was my first pizza after Passover. New York pizza, Chicago pizza, whatever. The best pizza is your first slice after Passover. Mom, yes, Marissa is doing live shows. She was in Minneapolis while I was in New York this time. Thank you, Christine. I'm going to put up the PayPal as well here. Just one guy. Gray's is still cheap. I still got 2 hot dogs and a papaya juice for like $6. Evelyn, I would run into Richard occasionally. Kristen, don't tempt me. I need to get more use out of that poem. Richard Crowe and I knew each other and like give each other a 2-finger salute from across the streetway.
Right in the urban room of the Congress Hotel in Chicago, and dance some more to Benny Goodman and his orchestra, and hear Helen Ward sing "Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo."
All right, I'll make it through the song here before I log off. Good night, Mona. Miles made his appearance earlier today. Miles, you want to come over? Come say hi. Latecomers, missed you. And you're on every tour. Once again, for the new people, there's a group called Mysterious Chicago Regulars in Miles Fan Club. Carol, yes. We will be doing Whiskey and a Cookie tomorrow. My friend Jessica the Meat Scientist is planning to come on as well. Even Mr. Crosby sings it. Now, Gene, the throat's gotten better every day since it started hurting. It's not really the throat, it's just that tonsil. Why do I keep fiddling with this? I'm using my AirPods as like a fidget spinner. And that messes with the audio on here. Kathleen, FAGF means Find a Grave Friday. That's the morning mini tour on Friday, where I go to a cemetery where I know a particular grave is located, but I don't find where in the cemetery it is or what it looks like. We figure that out in the comments, and then we play hot and cold till I find it. Sometimes it's very quick, sometimes we're out there for quite a while. But it's fun every time. And last week I was on the road with the school group, so I showed a bit of the columbarium at St. John the Divine. But I couldn't really do a proper find a grave. Jordana, congrats.
And we'll let the title speak for itself. Benny Goodman presenting Madhouse.
All right, everybody. So quick plug once again for the upcoming events. Upcoming virtually, Sunday morning we've got Art Deco Chicago. Then a week from tonight we're doing Johann Hawk. Really my favorite of the Chicago serial killers. I'm not saying he was a good guy. He was a bad, bad man. But he's a lot more fun to talk about than H.H. Holmes, honestly. Then the Saturday after that, we will be doing Rose Hill Cemetery at noon, and the Saturday after that, it's the Chicago edition of Grave Robbing 101 in person. AdamChicago.com or MysteriousChicago.com has links to all of the tickets for those things. So thanks a lot, everybody. I am Adam for Mysterious Chicago Tours. I will see many of you tomorrow for Find a Grave Friday, and the Whiskey and a Cookie Show on the Patty Vasquez Show Facebook page. So thanks a lot. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago, saying to stay safe. Stay strong, and of course, if you can, stay spooky, everybody.